Hello. Um, I'm not going to wait too long for people to start joining, um, just because I want to stay on time as much as possible. So as people join in, hopefully they'll submit their information so that we can send them what they missed. For those of you who aren't familiar, there is a chat down below that you should be able to use if you want to send any questions or communicate privately, or you have an option to chat with each other. So with that, we'll get started. This is Elections and Me. How does my participation matter? Just a little housekeeping. If you're not muted, you want to make sure that you are. I'll try to mute you if for whatever reason it becomes unmuted. So this is going to be a series of webinars where we're going to go over certain political aspects that affect us on a community level. This is a summary of it in whole. The breakout seminars will be about everything that we go over today, but just each section in more detail. So what we're going to go over today, voting rights laws and constitutional amendments. Within that, eligibility, voter ID fraud, campaign financing. And the second half an hour, hopefully we'll get to state, local elections, which consist of the election calendar, the legislature, census and redistricting, turnout, voter turnout specifically, gerrymandering, and local districts and representatives. Voting rights laws and constitutional amendments. So the US election laws date back to Article 1 of the Constitution. This gave the states the responsibility of overseeing federal elections. Many constitutional amendments and federal laws to protect voting rights have been passed since then. Constitutional amendments affecting voting rights. The 15th Amendment gave African American men the right to vote in 1870, but many weren't able to exercise this right. Some states use literacy tests and other barriers to make it harder to vote. We'll go over into some other aspects that also imposed on that 15th Amendment. The 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, gave American women the right to vote. Obviously, some of those same barriers applied as they did in the 15th Amendment. The 24th Amendment, ratified in 64, eliminated poll taxes. The tax had been used in some states also to keep African Americans from voting in federal elections. The 26th Amendment, ratified in 71, lowered the voting age for all elections to 18. Federal voting rights laws. Federal laws passed over the years help protect Americans' right to vote and make it easier for citizens to exercise that right. The Civil Rights Acts created some of the earliest federal protections against discrimination in voting. These protections were first outlined by the Civil Rights Acts of 1870 and were later amended by the Civil Rights Acts of 57, 60, 64, and one that's more familiar, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That prohibited voter discrimination based on race, color, membership, or language minority group, membership in a language minority group. It also required certain places to provide election materials in languages other than English. The Voting Accessibility for Elderly and Handicapped Act of '84 required polling places to be accessible to people with disabilities. So, you know, handicap accessible, basically. The Uniformed Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act of '86 allowed members of the U.S. Armed Forces and overseas U.S. voters to register and vote by mail. National Voter Registration Act of '93 created new ways to register to vote. It also called for states to keep more accurate voter registration lists. The Help America Vote Act, HAVA of '02, authorized federal funds for elections. It also created the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, the EAC. It helps states comply with the HAVA Act to adopt minimal standards on voter education, registration, and ballots. We'll go over these two later on under campaign financing. The Military Overseas Voting Empowerment, or MOVE Act of '09, that improved access to voting by military and overseas voters. Who can and can't vote in U.S. elections? You must be a U.S. citizen to vote in federal, state, or local elections. You can vote if you obviously are a citizen, meet your state's residency requirements. You can be homeless and still meet these requirements. If you're 18 years old on or before election day, and in some states, you can register to vote before you turn 18 if you'll be 18 by election day. And also if you're registered to vote by your voter registration deadline. Some states like North Dakota don't even have voter registration. You just go vote. Who can't vote? Non-citizens, including permanent legal residents, some people with felony conviction, some people who are mentally incapacitated. Those two are based on a, jurisdiction level. So by state, it may vary. And you can't vote for president in general election if you are a citizen and you reside in a U.S. territory. I'm going to be speaking locally, so Connecticut and my town, Waterbury. Connecticut voting eligibility. Are you eligible to vote? Basically, if you are at least 17 and turning 18 before election day, if you are a citizen and living in Connecticut, if you've been convicted of a felony, you can vote, but you have had to complete your confinement and parole. And Connecticut doesn't permit early voting at this time. Regarding residency, if you've moved recently, you have to update your voter registration to reflect your new address. If you move to Connecticut from another state, or if you moved to a different town within Connecticut, even if you move within the same town, your polling location may have changed. So your registration should always reflect your current home address. Even if you're a student, say in college, living on campus, you can vote in the town where you're going to school and living on campus at if you register there. Or you can choose to register in your hometown and vote there. When I was in school, I did both. I alternated. There were no restrictions. One year I voted where I went to school at, which was in New Haven. And then the following year I voted in my hometown, which was Waterbury. State voter ID laws. So this is a map basically illustrating the strictness of voter ID laws in the state. I'm sorry, in the country. From darkest green to gray, start with the strictest being the darkest end and going to gray being the least strictest. 2/3 of the state require you to show some form of identification in the United States before you're allowed to vote. So notably, the darker colors, the more stricter states. seem to be concentrated in the Midwest and some southern states. It broadens out the less stricter you get. Regarding my home state, Connecticut, even though we're not the least strict like Maine or Massachusetts or Vermont, where they don't require any kind of documentation at all, Connecticut doesn't require photo ID. It requests it. So if you don't have it, you just have to provide your name, date of birth, and address, and sign a document under penalty of making a false statement. So that's the one document that's required. You have to sign that document saying that the information you've given is true. Voter fraud, voter suppression, and other election crimes. Federal election laws help protect the election process. What are federal election crimes? They fall into three broad categories. So campaign finance. Those crimes are when candidates accept funds that violate the amounts or the donors permitted under law. Civil rights violations involving voter intimidation, coercion, threats, and other tactics to suppress a person's ability to vote. Voter fraud and voter registration fraud, such as when someone may legally cast a vote in the name of a dead person or someone who has moved. As we saw in the previous slides with these states, many states have strengthened their voter ID requirements to stop voter fraud. However, that can have an alternative effect where it's used as voter suppression. Is it legal for someone to ask you who you voted for? Is it legal for you to tell? You have the right to cast your vote in private. That's up to you whether or not you want to share who you voted for with others. There's no law preventing someone from asking you who you voted for, and likewise, no law preventing you from telling. How do you report voter fraud or voter registration suppression? If you suspect voter fraud, report it to your state or territorial election office. You can also report it to an FBI office, U.S. Attorney's Office, Public Integrity section of the Department of Justice's Criminal Division. If you witness or suspect intimidation or suppression, there are a few ways you can report that. Contact your state or territorial election office, voting section of the Civil Rights Division, that's within the Department of Justice, or use your election complaint report form, which you can find online. That's something you could just so much as Google. Anyone encountering election-related problems can contact the Election Day hotline, and this is not just on Election Day, that's just the name of the hotline. There's a phone number there, or an email, so 866-733-2463, and also the elections@ct.gov for Connecticut if you're reporting that. Federal campaign finance law. Federal law puts limits on campaign contributions to candidates for president and Congress. It requires states to report all the money their campaigns receive and spend. How much can you contribute to a candidate for federal office? For the 2019-2020 elections, it's $2,800 per election per candidate. Financial reporting requirements for candidates in federal elections. This act requires candidates to report where the money they raise comes from and the amounts where they spend and go, what amounts they spend and where that money goes to. So basically they follow the money. The law applies to candidates for president as well as for U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives. Federal Election Commission, or FEC, their role in campaign finance law sets campaign contribution limits for individuals and groups. It tracks campaign finance data and it oversees public funding used in presidential elections. Who can't contribute? Campaigns are prohibited from accepting contributions from certain types of organizations and individuals. These prohibited sources are corporations, including nonprofit corporations, labor organizations, and with both of these segments, all funds from that come from them, they can contribute if they're in a separate segregated fund. And that's something we'll get into momentarily. So there's caveats. Also, federal government contractors, foreign nationals, or making a contribution in the name of someone else. So some of those caveats came about with Citizens United. Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, or the FEC, like we spoke about earlier, is a case in which the US Supreme Court in January 21st of 2010 ruled in a 5-4 decision that laws that prevented corporations and unions from using their general treasury funds for independent electioneering communications or political advertising violated the First Amendment's guarantee of freedom of speech. In doing so, the court invalidated Section 203 of the Federal Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002, the BCRA, also one of the acts we reviewed earlier. The act is known as the McCain-Feingold Act for its sponsors, the departed Senator John McCain and Senator Russ Feingold, as well as Section 441B of the Federal Election Campaign Act of 71, the FECA, which the BCRA had amended. And these are important amendments that we reviewed in those first 2 or 3 slides. The court also overturned in whole or in part 2 previous Supreme Court acts. So it overruled its own acts, the Austin v. Michigan Chamber of Commerce in 1990 and the McConnell v. FEC in 2003. It immediately was perceived as historical important. The decision generated intense controversy outside the court. Some held it as a resounding victory for freedom of speech, while others criticized it as an overreaching attempt to rewrite campaign finance law. Among the critics was President Barack Obama, who remarked in his State of the Union address in the House of Representatives 1 week later that the decision would, quote, open the floodgates for special interests to spend without limit in our elections, end quote. His criticism provoked one of the Supreme Court justices that was there in attendance, Justice Samuel A. Alito, to break the quorum by mouthing the words, "not true." State and local elections. They can be held any year, anytime throughout the year for various things: governor, state legislature, mayor, judges, local officials, ballot initiatives. One popular one was Prop 8 out of California. They had a federal ballot initiative that basically proposed to not judge people based on their sexual preference in various aspects. So this year's election calendar really got jumbled around because of COVID. But today, as it stands, what has and will happen is this: on March 3rd, town committee members primary occurred, and these are locally to Connecticut and within my town of Waterbury. The absentee ballots, they'll become available on January 21st. Primary enrollment for party affiliated voters deadline, July 28th. Selection of delegates to state and district conventions party, March 24th, and it ran to the 31st. And the certification of those delegates was initially April 1st, and it's now July 28th. Nominating petitions. So if you want to nominate a new party or a no party, something other than the parties that we have, those nominations began on January 20th, and they have to be filed by the 5th. Primary party enrollment. So if you want to enroll in a party so that you can vote in the primary, you can mail it in, and it must be received by August 6th. Then there's a little leeway for a walk-in deadline, which is the day before on August 10th. That time deadline is by noon because the next day, the 11th, is the major party's presidential and local preference primary. That was originally for our state in Connecticut, the 28th of April, got pushed to the June 2nd because of COVID, and now it's on the 11th. The 11th was originally always held for the local primary, the state primary, and the federal one was going to be in April, but they just decided to combine them and have them both on the same day. And of course, the general election, the big one, is on November 3rd, and that's obviously for president, representatives of Congress, and states, anyone who won in the primary. Legislature, the Connecticut State Legislature. The House of Representatives in Connecticut sits in the lower chamber, and the Senate sits in the upper chamber. Together, they form the legislative branch of Connecticut. Our government is known as the legislature. It meets in the state capitol building in Hartford. They work alongside the governor to create laws, establish state budgets. They have legislative authority and responsibilities that include passing bills on public policy matters, setting levels for state spending, raising and lowering taxes, and voting to uphold or override gubernatorial vetoes. So whether or not they want to veto something that the governor is trying to do. All 36 Senate and all 151 House seats are up for election in 2020 within Connecticut. In 2018, the House Chamber's Democratic majority increased from 80 to 71 to 92 to 59. Democrats gained 5 Senate seats in 2018, shifting control of the Senate chamber from an 18-18 split to a 23-13 Democratic majority. Connecticut has a Democratic state government trifecta. A trifecta exists when one political party simultaneously holds the governor's office and majority parties in both legislative chambers. So they have the state house, they have the state senate, and the governor's office, all by one party. So now we'll get into the election cycle, redistricting, and the census. The outcomes of the 2020 election cycle in Connecticut stands to influence the state's redistricting process following the 2020 census. This is not something, this is countrywide, the way the census works. Redistricting is the process of drawing new congressional and state legislative district boundaries upon completion of the 2020 census. Connecticut will draft and enact new district maps. So obviously it's important to complete the census when you receive it, and we'll get into why. Redistricting, in Connecticut's 5 United States representatives and 187 state legislatures, they're all elected from political divisions called districts. These district lines are redrawn every 10 years following the census. Federal law stipulates that the districts must have nearly equal populations and must not discriminate on the basis of race or ethnicity. That's sometimes unreasonable and impossible based on how our communities are made up. and that kind of renders itself to gerrymandering, which we'll get into momentarily. Connecticut's House of Representatives is made up of 151 districts. Connecticut State Senate is made up of 36 districts. In Connecticut, the state legislature is primarily responsible for drawing both congressional and state legislative district lines. Following the 2020 census, Connecticut was apportioned 5 congressional seats. Apportionment is the process by which representation in the legislative body is distributed among its constituents. The number of seats in the United States House of Representatives is fixed at 435. The United States Constitution dictates that districts be redrawn every 10 years to ensure equal populations between districts. The population grows during this time. That is the purpose of the 10 years. Every 10 years upon completion of the US Census, reapportionment occurs. So within this census, it's supposed to reflect the population and how that population is represented in the Congress, whether it's state or federal. Each person that's elected is supposed to be there to represent that number in that population. So in Connecticut, our House of Representatives that have been apportioned have selected, the constituents have selected in the Senate, Richard Blumenthal and Chris Murphy. For the House of Representatives, we have 5 districts. So the first district is John Larson, second district is Joe Courtney, Rosa DeLauro has the 3rd district, and Jim Hines has the 4th district. Johanna Hayes has the 5th district. I broke that down just so we can see locally what that 5th district encompasses town-wise. So these are the towns that are within the 5th district at this particular time. What happens after the census and the district lines are drawn could change. District line maps must be approved by 2/3 vote in each chamber. If the state legislature is unable to approve new maps, a backup commission is convened to do it for them. And if the commission can't do it, then a judge is appointed to do it. The Connecticut Constitution requires that all districts, whether congressional or state, be contiguous or bordering. In addition, state house districts must not divide towns, except where it's necessary to comply with other legal requirements like population. And we'll see in the map later, this has been the case and is normally the case because Waterbury has several districts within it. In 34 of the states conducting legislative elections in 2020, the legislatures themselves will play a significant part in the subsequent redistricting process. In 8 of the next year's gubernatorial elections or governor elections, the winner will have veto authority over the state's legislative or congressional district plans approved by its legislature. A party that wins trifecta control of a state in which redistricting authority rests with the legislative body, they basically produce those maps for the remainder of the decade. So if there's a trifecta, however they want these maps to be drawn for the next 10 years, that's how it's going to be because there's going to be no other party opposing it. Trifecta shifts in the 2010 election cycle illustrate this point. In 2010, 12 states in which legislatures had authority over redistricting saw shifts in trifecta status. Prior to the 2010 elections, 7 of these states were Democratic trifectas. The rest were divided among governments. After the 2010 elections, 6 of these states became Republican trifectas. The remainder either remained or became divided governments. And I'll show you a table of what that looks like visually. The slide's a little blurry, but if you could see, let's see, for instance, in Iowa, their legislature draws their lines. Before 2010 election, they had a Democratic rule. After the 2010 election, it was divided. So it was divided between Republican and Democrat. So they had to figure out those maps. And the way it became divided could be a multitude of reasons, but obviously they did not get enough Democratic outcome. And then what ended up happening in 2018, the Republicans were able to push that over and gain the trifecta status. So now this is an example of going into the 2020 election. If it remains that way, that party will be able to draw those lines for the next 10 years. Following the 2010 United States Census, Connecticut neither gained nor lost congressional seats. Although Democrats control both chambers of the state legislature, Republican opposition prevented them from achieving the 2/3 vote that was required to approve the redistricting plan, or the map. So in that case, the commission had to come in, and the commission wasn't able to meet the agreement between the two, and a judge was appointed to have to do the map, and it wasn't ratified until 2012. But based on what the judge did allow the Democrats to retain all 5 congressional seats. So that's why we have those 5 districts. Election turnout. In 2019, I know this is a little blurry, but this is information that is available on the City of Waterbury website. Is very user-friendly. You can play around with different towns and different elections, and it gives you those numbers based on that amendment that we spoke about that required districts to keep better records of election registration. This is actual result of that. In 2019, Waterbury had about 44,000 Republicans who were registered to vote. 10,000 of them voted. So that's about a 22% turnout. They had 191,000 Democrats, but only 52,000 actually voted. That's about a 27% turnout. Statewide, there are about 2.1 million registered voters in the whole state of Connecticut, but only 728,000 voted. And that's about 33%. And that directly correlates to that map of how the parties change, where you have divided governments, then you have one party control, and maybe there's not enough turnout, and then everything switches. And then you have that particular party drawing those lines. And those lines are important because the census basically dictates the money for the next 10 years. And gerrymandering, we spoke about this earlier. It refers to the manipulation of district lines to protect or change political power. One political party uses its unilateral or trifecta ability to pass a map to lock in a disproportionate share of seats. And this is why those guidelines are there in terms of not drawing the lines based on race or ethnicity. But we see every day how divided our communities can be. So sometimes that's impossible to do, and that's where you get those leeways in which you can have one town broken up if it's not bordering like it should be, in order to combat these kinds of biases in the lines. But you have to have some kind of opposition to that. If there's a trifecta, there's no opposition, and they could break it up how they see fit in order to dish that money out for the next 10 years, however they want to. That is best served with their constituents and their party. A different kind of gerrymandering, which is what I'm just speaking about, also can take place when maps are drawn in a way that disadvantages a racial or ethnic minority group by distorting electoral representation, and it affects what laws are or are not presented that impact these communities. So there's a financial aspect, and then there's a socio-economic impact. So there's no meaningful representation when it's that kind of gerrymandering. And when people wonder why, hey, you know, the government isn't addressing the issues that are affecting my community, how are you being represented? Is it in an honest way that actually reflects those numbers that are there where you live? Or is it as a result of negative gerrymandering? And these are our districts in a glance. So for Waterbury, we have the 3rd and 5th congressional district. For the state Senate, we are in District 15 and 16. You see that that split there within the actual town in the state house. So Waterbury has 5 districts. For those that don't know, this is a very segregated town. And the way this map is split up shows that. And then on a local level, the aldermans, they're kind of like the local presidents of the town. So just like you have House representation for the state and Senate representation for the state, House and Senate representation on the federal level, you have it on a local level as well. And those are called aldermans. We have 5. And there's subsection by polling place where you get to vote. And this is the map. The map is really all over the place, but there is a science to the madness, and it makes sense, and it has to be this way. It's very user friendly. If you go to the city's website, the city's website breaks this map down. It breaks it down a lot, so you can click which map that you're trying to zoom in on. This one looks really convoluted because it's every option all into one. I just wanted to give it to you whole first. But you can, if you see the, let's see, the congressional district is outlined in purple. So that's why you see the whole town outlined in purple, because we're the 5th district. The one outlined in green. So you have the legend over here, 2nd district, the green there. These are all the streets up in the upper right-hand corner. So all you have to do is go to the street. You can use the control find feature to find your street. Let's say I used Orange Street earlier. And next to it, there's the grid of where you can find it. So it said G8, and that would be right here in this section. So G8 encompasses District 2-2. So that stands for Waterbury District 2. And if you note, there's 2-2, and then there's 2-5, and then there's 2-3. So, and there's also 2-1. So, and 2-5, so, and 2-4. So District 2, it has a lot of polling places. That is a big part of the North End. And sometimes people actually live on the border of a district, so they can vote in one or more places. At one time, I had 3 different options of places where I could vote. And here you have the district polling places. So we were talking about District 2 and those 5 that they have. These are all the places that they can vote. AME Zion, Reed School, Wilson School, Regan, Bergen Apartments. And some of them, they may be able to go to 2 or 3 of those if they're on the border. And that's why it's important to keep your address updated, so you know where you go and your vote will be counted accurately for that particular district. For the person who represents that district, you want your vote to go to the people who you're supposed to be voting for, that are supposed to represent you. So it might seem frivolous, this address thing, but you can see how it correlates all the way up to the top. This is the majority party of aldermen in the city of Waterbury. Because there's a democratic majority, they get 2. So each district has 2 aldermen. We're focusing on District 2. So District 2, there's Victor Lopez and Belinda Weaver. So any issues locally that affect you directly on a day-to-day basis, that's who you want to contact first. The minority party right now is the Republican Party, so they have 1 each for each district. So for District 2, the Republican representative is Vernon Matthews. So in summary, how do you participate? What can you do? You can basically hold the line drawers accountable. The people who draw these maps are the people who work for you. Pay attention, speak up, vote, obviously, call your state legislatures, participate in community mapping events. Yes, those things exist. Here are some helpful links. Contacts, the mayor, city hall, register of voters for both the Democrat and Republican. The municipal building, which has a lot of government offices, the city clerk. And pay attention, become familiar with the people that you employ, your local, state, and federal representatives. You pay them, hold them accountable. If you don't understand something, take the time to research it and ask, inquire, like if your life depended on it, because it actually does. It depends on your life and the lives of the people you love, not just the ones that are here today, but their lives and maybe some newborn lives within the next 10 years. Obviously, yes, vote, but cast an educated vote. Like, you should be fully informed on your vote. The information you get on your vote should be by vetted sources, not, ignorant rhetoric that maybe comes across on your social media in a meme or something like that, or a screenshot. Do the work. This is your life. Be ready to defend your vote. And anything that reflects your values and your beliefs, whatever they are. Participate in every census that you live through, because anything that directly affects you and yours on a local level has to be funded. And those funds are justified by the statistics presented in the census, again, for the next 10 years. Educate people on how important this is. Share any information that you've received here today. We hope you'll return for other sessions, invite people along with you. And again, everything that we went over has a breakout section where we'll go over each of those items in detail. Share your interests, put it in the chat. If you don't have a Zoom account and you just logged in on the link, then you can put your email information in the chat. That way we can keep in contact with you or answer any questions that you have. And again, thank you for your attention to our community and your own community. Don't forget to complete the poll that you see there at the end. And that will be all. Stay safe out there. And thank you, guys. for dropping in.